Hello there, Malcolm here with my 195th Booktube video, and today I'll be bringing you June's wrap-up and July's TBR. I can tell you I finished 13 titles in June, totaling 2,203 pages, which puts me 3,475 pages up on the same time previous year, and also 38.82 hours on Audible. So with all that to get through, let's get cracking. So first up, I listened to The Demolished Man by Alfred Bester. This was read by Gerard Doyle, who I thought did a really good job, however was a little quiet. I tried listening to this on the bus while us Asmodee Games demonstrators were ferried from the hotel to the UK Games Expo in Birmingham and back, and over the chatter and the noise of the bus it was very difficult to hear some of it. Not the loudest of voices, but a really good performance nonetheless. The Demolished Man is set in a future where people have telepathy, or some people do, and in this world where every thought can be known, a man does the apparent impossible and commits murder, leading to a Columbo-style story where we witness the murder take place, and then we follow the detective as they put the clues together to find their culprit. This was a reread. I've last read this back in 1995 or thereabouts, and like with any reread after a long time, it's really interesting what I remembered and what I hadn't. But yeah, the story flowed really well, the characters were fun, and I really enjoyed the way the story played out. Booktastic. I then read my book of the month, which was Breathe by Sarah Crossman. Now normally I do an individual video, but frankly I can't be bothered. And this is a dystopian style story where all vegetation on Earth has pretty much died, and people have to live in domes where the last trees also exist. But oxygen is very much monitored and controlled, which would be fine except for the class difference. The rich live in nice, well oxygenated areas and have a lot of freedom, and the poor live in less well oxygenated areas and are taxed heavily if they use more than the daily allowed oxygen levels. No strenuous exercising, no heavy breathing, and of course, like all these sort of things, there's a conspiracy, and we follow three young people, one from the poor area, one from the rich area, and a rebel who's more aware of what's going on outside the domes. They sort of team up, revelations are made, and a larger scale revolution is begun. Now this is definitely book one. It leaves you off with things just starting to get going, and so I'm a little bit disappointed that it doesn't have a contained story within it. You do really need to read book two, titled Resist, where presumably the story is concluded. But in and of itself, I really enjoyed the story. Very familiar if you know things like The Hunger Games or the Silo trilogy or Maze Runner. Very much in that sort of vein. You know, you jump between, I think, three characters, which I've already mentioned. I would recommend this one. It was quite good, worth buying. And after that, I then read Simpsons Comics Belly Buster. 6 more stories. So there's Where's Maggie? Where Lisa joins a babysitting group to find there's far more going on in there than first meets the eye. And Homer, in the heat wave, decides to wear painted on clothes rather than the real sort, which is fine when he starts at the top half, but when he moves on to the bottom half, it goes down less well. And then there's Bart and Lisa and Marge and Homer and Maggie to a lesser extent versus Thanksgiving. Homer eats the Thanksgiving turkey before anyone turns up, despite a lot of people being invited, and it's Marge's Jingle All the Way style story to try and acquire a turkey before everything kicks off. The Beer Boys, where Homer, Lenny, Carl and Barney form their own bar. Tanks for Nothing. For some reason Homer gets hold of a tank, and by driving it about collapses the ceasefire that Springfield have with Shelbyville, or rather Springfield Power Station and the Shelbyville Power Station, and there becomes an arms race between the two neighbouring towns. Siege on Evergreen Terrace. Homer illegally takes delivery of the Flanders swimming pool, which after installed they come back to remove, but due to its huge popularity with the area, fences have been put up and there's now a full-blown siege against the Simpsons house in order to retrieve this pool. And the Yes Man Who Would Be King, where Smithers has more than a passing resemblance to the King of Sweden, and while they wait for the DNA test to prove or disprove this, the validity of his claim to the throne, the Springfield pretty much elevate his status to King of Springfield. Yep, 6 great stories, plus a whole load of bonus content and other stories worth buying. And after that I then read, or I should say finally finished reading Old Venus, short story collection edited by George R. Martin and Gardner Dozos. A bunch of short stories written in modern times but assuming that Venus was inhabitable, as a callback to the stories of the 1940s and 50s before probes and such like went to Venus and found just what a desolate death trap it really is. And so in these stories, Venus is hot, Venus is wet, it's got jungle, it's got dinosaurs, it's got fungus, it's got breathable air. It's got indigenous life. Well, in some cases. There are variations on that, obviously, in terms of how breathable the air is, how virulent the fungus is, and how ferocious the dinosaurs are, and how intelligent the indigenous life is. And we have a bunch of stories set in this world with humans who have come over there or have been there for some time. Yeah, a really good collection. I think the only duff one for me was the last one, Botanica Veneris, 13 paper cuts by Ida Countess Rathangan, which took me a while to work out just what the hell was going on and all that. But the rest were really good. Standout for me was probably By Frog Sled and Lizardback to Outcast of Venusian Lepers by Garth Nix. That was a really good one. That had really virulent fungal spores and you couldn't breathe the atmosphere in case you get infected. And that had a good sort of rescue style story with a difference. But yeah, really good collection. Highly recommend this. Worth buying. And after that, I then read, or rather listened to, The Midwich Cuckoos by John Wyndham. I've been going through the John Wyndham selection on Audible, and this was narrated by Stephen Fry. And I hadn't realised until a little way in where I'm thinking, this story is very familiar, that this is the basis of The Village of the Damned. So I didn't know the two were related. That's like, this is a very familiar plot. So I had to look it up. That explains what's familiar. Anyway, for those who don't know either The Midwich Cuckoos or Village of the Damned, a village in the middle of nowhere really falls asleep unaccountably. There's a definite boundary around this village where if you pass through it, you literally crumple to the ground asleep. And then suddenly everyone wakes up and it becomes quite apparent that all of the women of an eligible age are now pregnant. And the children that they eventually give birth to appear totally normal to start with, except that they have the power of coercion over their mothers in terms of when they want feeding, when they want changing, whether they want to go anywhere or not. And as they grow up at twice the normal rate of normal babies, the potential threat that they have towards the whole of humankind becomes a little bit more certain. Told from the point of view of a man and his wife who happened to have just been out of the village at the time of the incident and actually spent a good time of the story away from the village. And so we don't know what's going on because they're off doing something else and they come back to find out what's happened in their absence. So I really enjoyed it. I have seen a version of The Village of the Damned, I think a more recent one, with Christopher Reeves and Mark Hamill, so not that recent. But really, really good. More of a psychological horror than a straight up one. Fantastic. And after that, I then listened to The Day of the Triffids, narrated by Kingsley Ben-Adir, who again did a really good job. This was a reread for me. I had read this again back in about 1995 or thereabouts, and is the book that John Wyndham is best known for, and I think certainly has had the most films, TV series, and pop culture references too. And having reread it, I can see why. Now last month I mentioned about the Kraken Wakes and why aren't people talking about that one so much, because that was absolutely fantastic as well. But certainly Day of the Triffids does deserve the recognition that it gets. Absolutely fantastic view on how society collapses in a post-apocalyptic setting. Everyone wakes up and they're blind. And we follow one man who was just coming out of eye surgery, so missed the event that caused everyone to go blind in the first place, and is one of the few sighted people in this new world, in which are also voracious walking plants, 10-foot whips which can kill with a single sting, called Triffids. Just been waiting for this opportunity and are now running amok, causing much death and mayhem. And again, in similar sort of vein to War of the Worlds, because we're following a man on the ground, as it were, there's no great government, there's no great overarching organisation that knows what's going on. It's just people fumbling about, just trying to make the best out of a bad situation and trying to get through. And of course, things falling apart, things working not so well as other things, and killer plants mucking everything up. But like with all these things, it's actually other people are the bigger threat than the plants. So a really good zombie apocalypse story, but without any zombies. Absolutely booktastic. And after that, I then read Marvel Select X-Men Days of Future Past Doomsday. You have to see Days of Future Past, but from what I understand, that in a future, the world is pretty much over. The mutants have all been hunted down and exterminated, and the few left do a last-ditch attempt of sending somebody back in time to, before it all kicks off, to stop whatever happening, and then hopefully having a new trouser of time in which this disaster doesn't take place. This isn't that story. This is the story of how we got from everything being hunky-dory to making this decision to send people back. And so we basically have death on every page of all sorts of major characters, and we start off sort of somewhere in the middle and the survivors are running away, being ripped apart left and right. But then we have a flashback to the beginning where we have Spider-Man swinging in to save the day of an unruly mob who promptly beat him to death. Yeah, so it starts off on a really strong footing in terms of how the superheroes are doing. Yeah, really depressing, but pretty well told. And it also includes the original Days of Future Past saga, which is sort of hinted at the end of the first story, but you know, you get the full picture in the original coverage of that tale. Worth buying. And after that I then read Star Wars, The Clone Wars Gambit Stealth by Karen Miller, set in the Clone Wars series, where Anakin and Obi-Wan are sent to a planet undercover in a stealthily way to determine whether or not there's a weapon of mass destruction being constructed by the Separatists. Of course there is. Not a great surprise, it says so in the blurb on the back. And of course the mission doesn't go to plan and they end up just trying to survive. And Karen Miller does an excellent job of making these characters feel like real people with their interactions, their friendships, their likes, their dislikes. Now in a previous book, The Clone Wars Wild Space, Obi-Wan and Bail Organa get trapped on a planet together and they both don't trust each other to start with. One's one of these weird, lofty Jedi, and the other one's a politician and so can't be trusted. However, a deep friendship is created between the two by the end of this book. And it's a friendship that she draws back on for this book, which on the one hand is really nice to see that friendship grow and blossom, but on the other, it's very isolated because any book written by any other author, this friendship is not even mentioned. And there's also a character here which is created purely for this book, where Obi-Wan has more than a subtle thing for, and she is a childhood friend at the Jedi Academy who's dying of some disease. And she goes, well, how come I've never heard of this character before? And certainly no mention of her in the Jedi Apprentice series, where there is another character which he has a bit of a thing for, but I'm not quite sure why they didn't use the same cat. Never mind. And that aside, although this is a The Clone Wars book featuring Ahsoka, who, as I've said before, is a great character, but I never considered to be canon because I can't get her to fit in the films. She is in it, but barely, and it's a case of, well, why make this one of the Clone Wars books rather than have it as a Clone Wars book? I mean, it does reference a couple of scenes from the Clone Wars. I can't remember the episode, but it's one where Anakin is knocked out quite early on. I think it's a two-part episode where Anakin is knocked out and an inexperienced Ahsoka has to try and save the day with an unconscious or severely injured Anakin. Anyway, this book, really good, really enjoyed it. Like I say, I love the personification of the people in this. Karen does a great job of this dialogue and interaction and making the characters feel like real people, as well as feel like the characters from the films as well. However, the big negative I had for this is it doesn't have the whole story in it. This is one half of the story. Not left on a cliffhanger per se, but just left unfinished. Definitely worth buying. And after I then read Marvel Select Deadpool Core Assemble, which as far as I'm aware is like the precursor to Deadpool Core, featuring Deadpool, Lady Deadpool, Dogpool, Headpool and Kidpool, all from across the multiverse. And very similar to the What If Miles Morales edition from a few months ago, this is a series of short stories introducing each character, and then at the end they get drawn into, we need you for the big thing they're going to go and do, and then the final story is the big thing that they're all brought together to do together to overcome whatever it was they had to do. Each story felt very different and had different artists, so looked different, but each one was absolutely brilliant, hilarious, funny, silly, outrageous, everything you would hope for from a Deadpool comic. Worth buying. And after that I then read, or listened to, The Trouble with Lycan by John Wyndham, read by Vanessa Kirby, who again did a really good job. This one took a little while to get going as we're introduced to the main character as she is born, grows up and then leaves home to go and study. But effectively it follows a scientist who discovers a lichen that effectively slows down the aging process up to 5 times, and she discovers it independently to her boss, and they both independently, and they struggle to know what to do with it. Obviously they both take it for themselves, but her boss gives it to his kids without their knowledge, and she opens up a beauty parlour where beauty parlours that promise to give youthful looks actually delivers, which comes up with a really interesting case where there's a threatening to sue when people find out what's happened, and she says, well, what are they suing me over? I'm delivering what I've promised, unless they came in expecting the lie that every other one does, and so on what grounds can they sue for me giving what I said they were going to do, even though they expected it to be a lie? It's a very interesting discussion. And what I did like about this one actually was the sensationalist adverts and news reports that John Wyndham had created, just using the language and exploring the attitudes that people will have when this thing becomes a reality to them. Rival companies, the church. And basically it's looking at the impact that such a thing can have on society. I mean, something we're seeing a bit today already with an ageing population who aren't allowed to retire until much, much later. More and more younger people struggling to get into the workplace or get any high-level jobs because they're already filled by the previous lot. And of course, with an extended life of up to 5 times, they just won't die. And so we're looking at potential of huge unemployment, an NHS that can't cope. Oh no, I'm sorry, I'm talking about the book. Written in the 1950s, this has actually been very prophetic of a lot of things that we're experiencing now, where really we're only looking at a decade or so of an extreme increased life expectancy from the 50s. And so it really does explore, you know, what would happen if people lived for 400 to 500 years. And of course, only the very rich could afford it, which is another interesting angle he covers. You know, really thought a lot about this one as more of a platform for thought than an actual story. There is a story in here, certainly, with a couple of twists and turns. Some are pretty obvious if you think about it, or certainly weren't surprising when they were revealed. But really enjoyed it. Booktastic. Sticking with John Wyndham, I then listened to The Chrysalids, narrated nicely by Noah Reid. Now this was a reread for me. Last read this about 12 years ago. And this is set in a post-apocalyptic future where there has been a nuclear war, but long enough ago that people alive don't remember it or what the world was like before. They live in sort of separate hamlets and groupings, towns, but have developed a religious fervour about the image of God. An aspect of the Bible is taken extremely literally in this case, and so any deviation, as it's called, or mutation, which is later referred to, is seen as a blasphemy, and in the crops and animals they're instantly destroyed, and in humans they are outcasts into the wilds, plots of land which haven't been tamed yet and contain all sorts of blasphemous variants on what has been deemed by the government as an acceptable image of what God intended. And we follow a young man called David who from an early age doesn't really understand this maniacal belief and makes a good friend in a little girl called Sophie who just happens to have an extra toe on each foot. And it's only a little toe, she can't be that much more different to a normal human. There can't be anything wrong with that, and keeps it a secret. However, he soon discovers he has his own secret in that he is able to communicate telepathically to a cousin of his, as well as some other people he's never even met, dotted around the place. And they very naturally and correctly keep this secret from the religious dogma around them. And all is fine and dandy until his younger sister is born and develops her ability, which is of several magnitudes greater than their own. And eventually they do actually have to go on the run to avoid persecution. And persecution really is the underlining thrust of this story, and taken literally as looking at mutations and deviations of what is acceptable as normal in that society. But of course you can superimpose any other differences or variances on what is considered socially to be acceptable, giving grounds for persecution. And an idea that is hammered home by David's half-uncle, who is a bit better travelled than the rest of the people in the area, and who's been to different lands where people are very different in various respects, but they true believe that their image is the true image of God, and any variations on what they are is an abomination or blasphemy. So who's to say what is the true image of God? Really, really interesting story. I didn't remember this one that well, even though it wasn't that long ago I'd read it, but really powerful stuff and very relevant today. Booktastic. And after that I read Barn Burner, another Simpsons collection, 6 more stories. So we got How the Vest Was Won. Bart goes on to a TV programme with Kent Brockman and snitches on Nelson Muntz for being a shoplifter, and Nelson promises to give some retribution. The programme gives Bart a safety vest and is therefore able to thwart various attempts on his well-being by the bullies. But at what cost? Mayor Mia Little. Homer hears that the electoral campaign for the mayor is to reduce the amount of beer that's allowed, and so he runs for mayor himself to make sure that doesn't happen. Things go about as well as you expect. Faking the Band. Very reminiscent to an actual episode where Bart is part of a manufactured boy band. This time Homer Simpson has created it because he thinks it's a get-rich-quick scheme. However, because they use fake voices, the artificiality of the whole thing quickly shows through. The Man with Two Wives. Burns loses Smithers to Homer in a bet, and Marge's nose is put out of joint as Smithers is a much better and dutiful carer of Homer Simpson than herself. Of course, she doesn't need to do anything because Homer will ruin things himself. The Paper Chase, where Bart starts up the paper round, but instead of delivering the papers, he creates his own newspaper with his own made-up stories, which causes chaos in Springfield. The Bogeyman, where Burns attempts to build a new golf course in a wildlife preservation area and is thwarted by Lisa Simpson. More great content, lots of extra bonus stuff as well, extra stories, fun adverts and all the rest of it. Worth buying. And finally, I then read Star Wars Clone Wars Gambit Siege by Karen Miller. This one really annoyed me because this wasn't on my TBR. I was going to read this next time round that the Star Wars books came up, but I couldn't leave it where it was with stealth, so I had to read this one and push everything else back a bit. So I did, and this literally kicks off where the previous book left off. So Obi-Wan and Anakin have just escaped certain death and crash land somewhere up north, where they end up in a mining town, mining the very stuff that has been turned into the bioweapon. And of course the miners aren't evil people, they're just trying to scrape a living, and they can barely do that. And so they're caught between helping the people there, not being able to communicate what's going on back home, and they're soon discovered, and their very presence there now threatens the various people that they've befriended and lied to. So nice complex story here. Again, great characterisation of the characters. You really believe that they're real people, real friendships, real fears, and all the rest of it. And again, Ahsoka is barely in it. She's sort of completely forgotten about. Turns up with the cavalry at the end, as I'd predicted, really. But apart from that, really good. A strong duology, worth buying. It's just a shame it's not part of what I consider to be the proper Clone Wars saga. With a couple of character tweaks and swap outs, you could have this tied into the Clone Wars series of books and graphic novels, which fit in with everything else nicely. But anyway, that's just my issue. That was what I read in June. My planned reading for July is, my book of the month is Space Worlds, Stories of Life in the Void, and these are from the 1940s, 50s and 60s short stories written by some of the greats that's dealing with spaceflight and space travel and space stations. Everything spacey racy, but written pretty much before we landed on the moon. Yeah, the latest story is 1967. Over halfway, really enjoying it so far. And after that, I'll then move on to the Young Jedi Knights series by Kevin J. Anderson and Rebecca Mester. This isn't quite all of them, I think I'm missing a couple, but I do want to read as many of these as I can. I think I've got 11 books here. And they basically follow Han and Leia's 3 children, Jaina, Jason and Anakin Solo, as they learn how to be Jedi. It's a younger readers series of books, along with some other young Jedi, including a Wookiee by the name of Lowbacker, go on various adventures. Looking forward to reading them, and hopefully can whiz through these pretty quickly. And if I do that, I'll then move on to Vector Prime, Book 1 of the New Jedi Order, and this one's written by R.A. Salvatore, which is a significant chapter in the Star Wars universe when extragalactic species, the Yuzhan Vong, invade. And they are naturally immune to midichlorians, and so the Jedi's abilities mean nothing against them. Pretty epic stuff, and there's about 20 books in the series, so that'll keep me going for a little while. I'm going to have to up my pace, because the rate I'm reading books at the moment, going through things, it'll take me about 10 years to get through that series, so I'm going to have to do something. And amongst all that, rather than just doing nothing but Star Wars for a bit, in between books I'll try and read some other stuff as well. So I've got Doctor Who Paradox Lost by George Mann. This is an 11 Doctor story with Rory and Amy. The best Doctor Who lineup ever, in my opinion. I have no idea what this one's about. London, 1910. An unsuspecting thief finds himself confronted by grey-skinned creatures that are waiting to devour his mind. London, 2789. The remains of an ancient android are dredged from the Thames. When reactivated, it is a warning that can only be delivered to a man named the Doctor. The Doctor and his friends must solve a mystery that has spanned over 1,000 years. If they fail, the deadly alien Squall will devour the world. The Squall feed on psychic energy. They spread like a plague, and if they are not stopped, they will strip the earth clean. And that's what a Squall looks like, some sort of gargoyle type creature. Interesting. Give that one a go. And I'll also try and read The Wilt Alternative by Tom Sharp. This is book 2 of the Wilt series. This is a reread. Real funny stuff. These are farces, misunderstandings, quite rude and crude in places, but very, very funny, or the potential to be. I'm still reading The Walking Dead Descent by Jay Bonazinga while boiling the kettle, and to my wife, I'm still reading Alien Clay by Adrian Tchaikovsky. Well over halfway now, really enjoying that one. Might even finish it this month. Of course, I'll continue with my Simpsons collection, and I'll also try and fit in, if I can, a book that my wife gave to me a couple of days ago, Keyforge, The Qubit Zirconium by M. Darusha Wem, tie-in novel to the card game Keyforge by Richard Garfield. It's a fun little card game where each pack of cards you get is unique, with the theory that you can literally open it and play a competent game against another player with their own new deck. Some decks are better than others, but anyway, this ties into that somehow. No idea how, but intriguing. And quite a fun cover. And of course, because I have nothing to read, I went to the library, but I picked up Kick-Ass, the graphic novel. I have read this before, but a while ago, so I would like to reread this one. Basically, a guy who can't feel pain puts on a wetsuit and goes to fight crime. Very bloody, very violent, in particular when Hit Girl enters the scene. Return to Aldebaran, parts 1, 2 and 3. These are a series of books that I keep seeing, keep thinking about. There was a lovely second-hand bookshop in Penn, which had a whole bunch of these, which I wish I picked up before they closed. Translated from French, going to France again soon, so I'll see if I can pick up some of the original versions there. Now, the French do graphic novels like nobody else. These are actually 18, 19 and 20 in the entire series, but there's a very nice catch-up at the front of this, so even though I haven't read any of the previous books, I'm coming in knowing a bit about what's going on, so looking forward to reading them. And books 3 and 4 of Sweet Tooth, Animal Army and Endangered. I read books 1 and 2 last year, really enjoyed that. It's a post-apocalyptic world where there's this disease that's killing humans, and every baby born is some sort of weird animal-human hybrid. And you follow Sweet Tooth, who's half boy, half deer, who seems to be the key to the plague, to something, and him and a particularly violent man called Jeopard go on adventures just trying to survive and go to a place. And at the end of the previous book, Jeopard had actually sold him to some men who'd been collecting hybrids in return of his wife's body. So a bad thing to do, but you can understand why. And of course Jeopard has a change of heart and goes to the rescue. So further adventures of this one, and I think there's another 2 books after this, so interested to see where the story goes from where I left it off. Get through all that, I'm doing rather well. Possibly massively over-optimistic there. If you don't try, you don't know. Hope you enjoyed that. Comments below, please. If you like things, don't like things, interested, not interested. Well, I'm sticking around this long if you have. And if you like what I've done here, then like it. If you like to see more, then subscribe. You don't have to. But otherwise, comment down below if you want to say nice things or helpful critiques. What books do you like? What books didn't you like? Have you read any John Wyndham? What's your favourite John Wyndham if you have? But as usual, if you have nothing nice to say, then please keep it to yourself. Thank you, and until next time. See you later.